we are ready whenever you are.
All right, I think we're going to start with a call to order. And I think Melissa's going to do a roll call vote.
Yes, I will go down the list of members. Please indicate if you're present or serving as a proxy, if not already indicated. Brian Powell.
Here.
ADOT Katie Proctor.
Here.
Charles Montoya.
I am here temporarily. Gina Montez will be taking over for me as my proxy once I leave.
Thank you. Roger Klingler. Roger. Gary Neese.
Here.
Carrie Dyrek. Carrie. Marcia Reed. Amber Wakeman.
Present.
Brent Billingsley.
Present.
Phil Dorchester. Grady Miller.
Here.
Kathy Valenzuela.
Here.
Pamela Thompson. Patrick Banger. Patrick. Kevin Phelps.
Here.
Julie's here. Jeff Kulaga. Jeff. Bill Stevens.
Here.
Reed Spalding. Reed, are you there? Anyone here from the city of Maricopa? Chris Brady.
Here.
Jill Kymack.
Here.
Jeff Tyne.
Here.
Ed Zerker. Is anyone there from Pinal County?
Yeah, this is Himanshu Patel.
Thank you, Himanshu. John Cross. John, are you there? Scott Smith.
Here.
Brian Myers. Jim Thompson.
Here.
Mike Frazier.
Here.
Andrew Ching.
I'm here.
Reyes Madrano.
Here.
Vince Lorfeis.
Present.
Jean Blackman. Jean, please let me know if there's anyone that I missed. We do have a quorum, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Melissa. So good afternoon, everyone. We do officially have our quorum present. Our virtual meeting of the MAG Management Committee is called to order. Please remember to mute your phone when you are not speaking. Members of the public were asked to submit written comments related to this meeting on the MAG website within 1 hour of the posted start time for the meeting. No comments were received. So moving to item number 2 is the Executive Director's Report. We have Amy St. Peter, MAG Deputy Executive Director, to give this report for Eric Anderson, who is not able to be with us today. Amy?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Next slide, please. I have 5 brief updates for the committee today. First, the census. The census count has been shortened by 1 month, and we have adjusted our regional campaign to reflect that shortened time frame. This includes a heightened emphasis on digital outreach and a continued focus on undercounted populations. We share your concerns that it is absolutely critical to have an accurate and thorough count. Next slide, please. We have updated the response rates by community as shown on the slide before you today. Please do let us know how we may support you in your efforts to ensure that every resident is counted. Next slide, please. This month at the Regional Council meeting, we will have a presentation on the recently released street count results. In the meantime, here are a few highlights. As in other communities across the country, homelessness is on the rise in this region as well. The numbers have been trending up for a number of years now, but this is the first time that the numbers of those on the street have surpassed the numbers of those in shelters. Next slide, please. Efforts are underway in the East Valley as well as the West Valley to address this critical need. Locally, we have heard that high eviction rates and the decreasing numbers of shelter beds have contributed to these increases. Eviction rates and evictions are stalled for right now due to the pandemic, but we fully anticipate that the impact of COVID-19 will result in these numbers increasing even more. Please do contact the Continuum of Care for more information and to let us know how we may support your local efforts. Next slide, please. This is an annual event, but this is the first time that we have hosted the Crossing Guards training virtually. When schools do open for in-person instruction, we want to make sure that all students can arrive there safely. We've trained more than 200 crossing guards as part of the Safe Routes to School program here at MAG. Thanks so much to all of the communities for your support and participation in this important program. Next slide, please. This training was recorded and will be posted online to ensure that all people can have access to this important information throughout the year. Next slide, please. For our fourth item, many older adults need transportation when they're no longer able to drive, but communities don't have to face this problem themselves. We've developed a toolkit that's designed to encourage foundations to support these transportation services for older adults, and we're helping them to engage with local governments even more successfully. This is part of Age Friendly Arizona, and it was achieved with support from the Federal Highway Administration. That report, that toolkit is available at the link available on your screen. If you have any questions on that, please do let me know. Next slide, please. And last, we want to honor the life of Mike McQuaid. He led an inspiring life as a valued community leader in ending homelessness. Today, thousands of people have homes and hope thanks to Mike and all of his efforts. He was one of many who lost their lives to COVID this past summer. We've lost a champion for good, as Governor Ducey has described him. May we carry on his work and continue to be inspired by his legacy. Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. Please do let me know of any questions or any assistance needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. And members, please contact Amy after the meeting if you have any questions regarding her report. So we will now go on to item 3, approval of the consent agenda. Agenda items 3A through 3E are on the consent agenda. Does any member of the management committee have questions or would like a presentation on any of the consent agenda items?
Madam Chair, I move to approve.
Thank
Grady
you.
Miller from Fountain Hills.
Bill Stevens, second.
And who is the second?
Bill Stevens, second.
All right, we have a motion from Grady and a second from Bill. Is there any discussion of the motion? So I'm going to ask Melissa to take a roll call vote for us, please.
Okay, I will call your name. Please indicate how you vote. Bryant Powell,
Yes.
Katie Proctor,
Yes.
Charles Montoya, Roger Klingler,
Yes. Yes.
Gary Neese,
Yes.
Carrie Dyrick, Marcia Reed,
Yes.
Amber Wakeman, Amber, Brent Billingsley,
Yes.
Phil Dorchester, Grady Miller,
Yes.
Kathy Valenzuela,
Yes.
Pamela Thompson, Patrick Banger,
Yes.
Kevin Phelps,
Yes.
Julie,
Yes.
Jeff Kalaga,
Yes.
Bill Stevens,
Yes.
Reed Spalding. Anyone from the city of Maricopa? Chris Brady,
Yes.
Jill Kymack,
Yes.
Jeff Tyne,
Yes.
Ed Zerker,
No. No, I didn't.
Himanshu Patel,
Yes.
John Cross,
This is Heather Wilkie temporarily for John Cross. We vote yes.
thank you, Heather. Scott Smith,
Yes.
Scott, Brian Myers, Jim Thompson,
Yes.
Mike Frazier,
Yes.
Andrew Ching,
Yes.
Reyes Madrano, Vince Lorifeis,
Yes.
Gene Blackman. Is there anyone that I missed? If not, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. That motion carries. So our next item on the agenda is the Regional Competitive Programs 2020 Call for Projects. Mr. Patrick Stone will provide a report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Management Committee, for allowing me to present this item today. My name is Patrick Stone. I'm the new Transportation Improvement Supervisor here at MAG. Next slide, please. So there's been some confusion about all the different revenue streams that flow to the region, how those fit together. So I'm going to start my presentation by giving you an overview of the funding and then the context for where the call for projects actually fits in. And just to reiterate, these funding allocation decisions were made in the RTP. Next slide, please. So this is a high-level view of the funding sources and uses. It's a lot of strings, it's a lot of lines, but we'll go through each of these individually and kind of talk about each program and how they work. Next slide, please. So the first one's very familiar to all the communities. This is the half-cent sales tax. As you can see, it's used to fund activities within the 3 life cycle programs, the arterial life cycle, the freeway life cycle, and the transit life cycle. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So these are the ADOT 15% funds. These are derived from the Highway User Revenue Fund, or HERF. Oh, apologize. If we could go back to the ADOT 15% fund slide, please. There, perfect. Thank you so much. So as I was saying, these are the Highway User Revenue Funds, or commonly known as HERF. And these are actually comprised of two separate amounts. There's actually what's called a 12.6% funding source, which is actually defined in state statute. Secondarily, there's a 2.6% funding source, which is actually State Transportation Board policy. Add the two together, it's 15.2%, hence the nomenclature of the ADOT 15%. And as you can see, both of these funding sources are used in the Freeway Life Cycle Program. Next slide, please. Oops, sorry. So next we have ADOT discretionary funding. And this is another way of saying this is actually the federal funding that's allocated to the state. A portion of that funding is used in the Freeway Life Cycle Program to make up the, and a lot of people heard this terminology, to make up the 37% funding that was agreed to back in the 90s as part of the Casa Grande Accords. Then there's also a portion of the ADOT funding, as you can see by the bottom line, that's used to fund transit projects. Next slide. Now we get to MAG federal funding, which is comprised of actually two different types. It's got both a statutory component, and then it's also got a discretionary component. And as you can see, it's actually used to fund numerous programs. You have 4 different programs. For the purpose of the presentation today, our focus is really going to be on that bottom right bucket that's called Other. Next slide, please. Next, we have the MAG federal transit funding that's allocated to the region by FTA. All of the Phoenix Mesa UZA goes through the city of Phoenix. MAG's the MPO programs, the projects in the TIP. Next slide, please. And then finally, the most, I don't even know what the term I'd want to look for, but it's that other color funding. It's the other piece to this puzzle, but that's the local funding. You can see it's the final piece of the puzzle. And as you can also tell, it covers all the programs and projects. Next slide. So what this slide shows, and hopefully what it'll emphasize to each of the members of the committee, is these are where the dollars are allocated for the next 4 years. As you can see, and I apologize, it may be difficult to read, but a significant amount of the funding is actually tied up in the life cycle programs, which are the top 3 rows, top 4 rows, if you see the two merged together. But there's also a lot of funding allocated to the regional programs. And what I've tried to do with this slide is those yellow highlights emphasize the areas that are in this call for projects. So you see it as quite a diverse set of funding sources and funding uses. Next slide, please. And then finally, this slide is sort of a snippet of the fact sheet that was sent out to all the members of the management committee. 2 things I really wanted to emphasize here. One, it shows the different, again, the color of money, the different buckets, if you will. Also the years available, which I think is critical, so can people see by year what funding sources, and then the total dollar amounts. We're looking at right about 17 million. But the critical piece of this slide is what's on the left-hand side, and it's really the deadlines associated with these calls for project. It's just make sure every agency has the opportunity to get in on time. As you can see on the slide, the first deadline, September 10th, and that covers the certified street sweepers, the paving of unpaved roads, the Pinal County Arterial Bridge Program, and then the Avondale-Goodyear Urbanized Area Transit. So those are all 4 due on September 10th. Then we have a second deadline, which is October 1st. And I apologize, there's actually a typo in this slide. It should be the Roadway Safety Program. It says Regional Safety Program. I apologize for that. And then also the non-infrastructure safe routes to school funding. And with that, Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'll open it up to any questions from yourself or the committee.
Yes, thank you for the update. Any questions from the membership? Okay, this item is not on the agenda for action. So moving on to agenda item number 5, update on the development of a new regional transportation plan. Ms. Audra Kestra-Thomas will give this update. Audra?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and members of Management Committee. Pleased to be here with you today to provide an update, the latest activities associated with the development of the next regional transportation plan, and specifically some work that we've had with the Management Committee work group over the last few months. Next slide. Next slide. Today's presentation will focus largely on what the next 6 months or so look like, and specifically how we go from our large needs catalog of a variety of priorities and needs to a refined and fiscally constrained investment portfolio. I'll first walk through the varying steps of the evaluation process, for which we have already reviewed with the Management Committee work group, and show how with each of these steps, we will narrow the number and size of projects and programs for consideration as we move more towards that fiscally constrained goal. The second half of my presentation, I'll focus and highlight on some of the feedback we have already received from the Management Committee work group as we work to implement some of these specific steps in the evaluation process. Next slide. So this is an overview of that performance-based evaluation process. You'll see on the front end, we have our full needs catalog. And as a reminder, this is comprised not just of the RTP call for projects, for which we initiated at the beginning of this year, but also contains system identified needs, studied needs by MAG and our partners, but also the number of projects that have been deferred out of Proposition 400. It's going to be a full portfolio of the variety of needs that exist in our region and will be cataloged accordingly. We'll also then be doing our first step, which is applying a regional significance test, where we identify and sort out regionally significant projects that we will score and to help identify the highest performing projects, but then also bundle smaller groups of projects into potential regional programs. Our regionally significant projects will move out of step 1 into step 2, which is a purely technical evaluation to help identify those highest of priorities, using the goals we've identified and the outcomes that the region wants. And then in step 3, we'll take a step back, taking those highest performing projects alongside our desired regional programs to see if it's the composition, the universe that we want to consider in scenario planning. This is our gut check moment to make sure we didn't miss anything that's important, and it represents another layer of the evaluation process. Step 4 is ultimately our scenario and trade-off analysis. This is where we'll apply several different things, different funding scenarios to test if we can, what we can afford under a half-cent scenario, 3/4 cent or a full cent sales tax scenario, as well as other and different policy considerations. So what I'll do now is go through each of these steps in a little bit more detail so you understand better how we will apply and narrow projects and programs. Next slide. So the first step is that regional significance. And here's where we take the complete needs catalog and apply this definition to every single project that was submitted from the RTP call for projects, every single deferred project out of Prop 400, every other studied need. If projects are regionally significant, they'll move on to individual scoring in step 2. But if they are identified amongst others, they may be grouped into potential or bundled into potential programs. And these buckets, if you will, are going to be important for you to consider. And we will be seeking your direction on whether or not any of these or what one of these buckets are of highest priority for regional consideration. We are preparing this needs catalog as well as applying this first step of regional significance now. And this will be a topic that we first start discussing at our next management committee work group in September. Next slide. The second step applies to those regionally significant projects, those that can be evaluated on a technical level individually. We will be identifying potential evaluation criteria to apply against those projects and the outcomes that you've indicated you want the region to deliver. At this stage, projects will be competing against or within modal categories. So freeway and highway projects will compete against other freeway and highway projects. Arterial projects will compete against other arterial projects. And high capacity transit projects will compete against other high capacity transit projects. Next slide. This isn't unfamiliar. In fact, it's how we implement several of our programs here at MAG already. It's also standard practice in developing now required performance-based plans across the country. Next slide. Step 3 is where we step back and validate that the highest performing projects that came out of the technical analysis and the refined grouping of potential regional programs makes sense. It's the composition of projects and programs you want to consider. And it's our gut check, if you will, to make sure we haven't missed anything. We'll be looking for your direction to help identify any good projects that may not have otherwise been identified in the pure technical analysis, make sure we're not missing anything, and to identify any anomalies or things that may address specific or really unique regional needs that we want to continue to pull forward for future analysis in scenario planning. Next slide. And then step 4 is where we weigh our trade-offs. It's where we compare those different funding alternatives to see what we can afford in different scenarios. It's where we stress test against future uncertainty. We'll assess whether or not we're achieving the outcomes with the selection of projects and programs identified. And it's also where we identify and answer some really key questions. What are the regionally significant projects that we'll be recommending? What regional programs will we want to establish, and what will the funding levels be associating with each of those programs? And ultimately, what will we be asking of voters to approve? This will be important as we move later into the process this winter, based on the feedback we receive over the next couple of months. Next slide. So as noted, we've already had some conversations with the management committee work group, and I want to provide some of the feedback that we have received. Next slide. And specifically the feedback we received on this step 2, which is our project level evaluation, as well as program and project validation. Next slide. So in July, we had 2 management committee work group meetings and even had some homework assignments for the group. These 2 homework assignments are actually included in today's agenda packet. I'll be going ahead and summarizing some of the feedback we have received, but I want to encourage additional feedback today and throughout this month as we move this presentation through our policy committee process. Next slide. So we had asked whether or not the 6 goals that we have identified, if those goals were more important than others. And while we identified and got feedback that indicated that the mobility and safety and prosperity goals may be a little bit more important, I do want to indicate that a couple members of the work group said that they are equally important, as well as each of the 5 goals, except for livability, got at least a top priority vote from somebody. What this really tells us is that operationalizing weighting, if you will, probably makes more sense as we go through the project evaluation process, where we acknowledge different projects achieve different outcomes. Next slide. So as mentioned, we'll be evaluating those projects in modal categories. And so I'll provide some of that specific feedback that we've received in those 3 categories in this next coming slides. When we look at freeway and highway, without doubt, we saw lots of emphasis on connecting projects that connect to employment, projects that relieve bottlenecks or address existing congestion issues and safety matters. But we also received some feedback that potentially considering where future residential growth will occur, potentially considering projects that can accommodate multimodal applications, as well as, in addition to employment, linking, of course, activity centers. Weighting more on the mobility, safety, and prosperity goals may make sense in this particular category when evaluating freeway and highway projects. Next slide. Regarding our arterial projects, lots of emphasis here on safety, specifically identifying projects that relieve crash history locations, and specifically considering bicycle and pedestrian crashes. Also focus on future and existing employment connectivity. Other suggestions included complete street considerations, again, underscoring the importance that we've heard about active transportation considerations, recognizing future residential growth in areas that we connect to. And then here, weighting also on safety, mobility, and prosperity, but I would note that we received feedback on the importance to also consider arterial maintenance and preservation needs in the arterial category. Next slide. And then finally, the 3rd category, high capacity transit. Loud and clear, we heard the importance of identifying ridership potential and evaluating candidate projects. Again, this is what's unique about transit compared to roadway projects. We did receive a few other considerations, including connections to activity centers or existing and planned high capacity transit. Again, thinking about that systems approach to this matter, as well as serving existing and future high density residential. Without doubt, weighting here is squarely on mobility. Next slide. So we also received other feedback on some of the other goals. The livability goal in particular, we saw strong support for its application in evaluating potential regional programs. Of note, that includes support for a robust active transportation program and, of course, air quality programs. We also received some other feedback that applies to maybe our steps 3 and steps 4, and I wanted to make sure to highlight it today for you as well. We received ideas of considering in step 3 the composition of investments that make it to that stage to ensure that there's regional balance. A suggestion to consider historic or legacy projects with extra consideration or even priority, as well as consideration for the opportunity for jurisdictions to identify individual priorities. For scenario planning, we were suggested to consider whether candidate projects are included in adopted plans and have local funding commitments associated with them, as well as to consider alternative funding options, such as leveraging private investment opportunities to better enable project delivery. Next slide. We received some feedback on the implementation as well. Lots of emphasis on the need for flexibility in our programming process and the ability to be flexible and respond to change. But we also received some more longer-term feedback when we get to actual project development stages. Consideration for the secondary impacts of some of our larger projects, construction projects in particular, to ancillary infrastructure. Being cognizant and recognizing first and last mile solutions or other infrastructure associated with some of our high capacity investments, as well as identifying important regional considerations into project scopes. Notably here, our wrong way driver matter that's of top of mind in this region, or other safety countermeasures. How can we include them in project scopes when we get to project implementation? I want a final note here on preservation. While it has largely scored a little bit lower in terms of priority, it does remain an important consideration. And it's especially reflective in the diverse needs and the different development patterns that we see across a really large region. We expect this to be a really robust conversation as to whether or not maintenance and preservation is identified as a regional priority. Next slide. Next slide. So before we open it up for discussion, feedback, and questions, I do want to highlight a couple of key deliverables that are forthcoming. And if there's one thing I would like for you to take away from today's presentation, it's that September is going to be a significant milestone for the process and to informing some of the questions you've been asking. In early September, as already noted, we'll be delivering our peer region analysis. Amongst other things, it's going to show a comparative funding analysis of our portfolio of funds compared to other regions. And of course, we'll be delivering our needs catalog. I can't emphasize enough how big of a deliverable this is. It's going to not only catalog all of our needs, those deferred out of Proposition 400, those that you've submitted as part of the call for projects, those that have been otherwise studied, and sort them by which are regionally significant projects and what are bundled into potential future regional programs for consideration. This in particular is where we will be seeking direction. We want to know what we missed. We want to specifically have you discuss and identify what potential programs are or should be regional priorities. And we want to answer questions such as, should funding future technology be a regional priority? Should beautification and public art programs be a regional priority? Should commuter rail be a regional priority? Should pavement preservation be a regional priority? I assure you, we're going to have several dozen of those programs for your consideration, and we'll be looking forward to your feedback accordingly. We also know that you have several other policy questions, and working with the chairwoman, we will be documenting a list of these policy questions that was first started at management committee work group, and distributing this to management committee within the next week for your additional feedback. We see an opportunity at the September 9th meeting to start some discussion around this document and further the conversations accordingly. I also want to note that several of those fundamental policy questions do reside around transit and the future of regional transit. We have received a few questions along the way about the roles and responsibilities associated with transit planning, and included as a second memo in today's management committee agenda is an overview of some history around this topic and some reference documentation, including state statute that helps and hopes to clarify the Maricopa Associations of Governments role in regional planning and policy considerations. Ultimately, however, we see the second meeting in September, September 30th for management committee work group to be a first opportunity to dig deep into some of these regional transit considerations where we can focus and start to answer and consider what's the region's approach to future bus service. What's the region's role in funding transit, and what's local communities' role in funding transit? This will just be a start, but certainly intend it to be a robust conversation throughout the fall. Next slide. Madam Chairwoman, the final thing I'll mention before turning it back to you is that we are initiating final stages of website launch for Momentum. This includes a few questions that we'll be asking from the public on how and what they see as priorities related to those 6 goals that we have identified. Direction from the management committee work group is that might be a first good step to see what are priorities as it relates to those 6 key goals that we have already identified for the regional transportation plan, to bring that feedback back to you for consideration. So with that, Madam Chairwoman, that does complete my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions and entertain dialogue.
All right.
Thank you. Management Committee, certainly an important issue, so I'd like to open the floor for questions or comments on the update.
Julie?
Yes, Marcia?
Yeah, so I appreciate the presentation Audra just made. I just think that it's good for all of the managers to hear, at least from my perspective. I appreciate the homework and all of that stuff that has been done and MAG giving us those results. But I just want to make sure everybody understands there's not been a real conversation about those results. And I'm hopeful that we can still have that conversation at maybe whatever the next upcoming meetings are. I appreciate Audra's at least discussion today about some of the policy issues that I feel like that as managers, our elected officials are looking at us to at least provide input on. Ultimately, they are the policymakers. I think everybody understands that. We all are managers. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure that all of the managers realize that even though these things have been given to us, as again today, there hasn't been really good candid conversations about that. And how are we going to go about getting that candid conversation started?
Thank you, Marcia. If I could add, Audra had mentioned we've begun working on a policy document that I think captures what we've been kind of referring to as elephants in the room. Some of these issues that have been in the air for a couple of years now, but we really haven't been, we haven't had the moment in time to discuss them. So following today's meeting, I would like to distribute, again, it's very drafty, but would like to distribute that document to the management committee for your input and feedback and make sure we've captured at least what we see as the key issues, outstanding issues. And as mentioned, we'd be digging into that document to create some frameworks at that September 9th work session, which again, I'd like to remind everyone is welcome to attend. I know that there's a group who've committed to attending those meetings and are actively working together, but we are doing them also virtually, and it is an opportunity for everyone to participate in those. Jeff from Peoria.
Great, thank you. And Marcia, yeah, I think that was very well said. And Julie, really appreciate you taking the lead and putting together with Audrey the list of those considerations and discussions. And love to see that that's placed and being discussed at the first September meeting. I'd recommend maybe once we go through that the working group get a better feel for when those issues need to be decided. I completely understand that some of these policy issues would up front and some have to redo scenario planning. But if we're going to help in decision makers, make sure that TPC and our regional council know some of the big issues that are coming in advance, it'd be great to know where we believe those policies should be discussed in the process we have. That's about it, but thank you very much for the support.
Who's next?
Julie?
Yes, go ahead.
This is Chris Brady. So, Audra, thank you. And I'm just going to say ask some specific things for follow-up. I'd like to know from MAG staff if preservation has been a allocation in any of the previous propositions, because my impression is that we've always done capital. And so the question, I guess, for me is, unless we've done preservation in the past, would this be a significant adjustment or a policy direction if we were to take on maintenance? So I'd like to know first, but historically, have we ever done maintenance, included maintenance in a proposition program? And then second of all, I'm not giving up on my comments. I know Eric tried to respond to it. I know he's provided a memo. I'm just going to share with MAG staff, since I've got a city council member who sits and chairs one of the regional transportation, the metro transportation boards. I don't think it's settled on how comfortable some of the cities are that have both light rail and bus about how we're integrating the input from what I consider our native local experts in transit and how that's feeding into this process. Because I feel like we've got multiple consultants, MAG consultants, Metro consultants. We've got to make sure this all comes together, because I can't have elected officials on one side and elected officials on the other side opining on different ways about how we're going to prioritize and which projects are going to be in bus or light rail. So we've got to figure out how that comes together. And maybe we have a historical perspective, maybe we have agreements, but we also have to deal with the political reality that if we as a region and politically we don't have buy-in, then it's going to hurt our efforts moving forward. So we got to hash that through a little bit more. And I think when we have those conversations, we got to have MAG staff and Metro staff and all the right players in the room to make sure we're comfortable with making sure we're staying on the same page and moving the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I want to second that comment as well. I have a different member who sits on, it's my mayor on TPC and regional council, and my vice mayor sits on Valley Metro. And I think that there is still some confusion over those roles. So thank you for that. Other questions, comments? All right, well, thank you, Ms. Thomas. It was not for action either. So we're going to move to item number 6, which is a legislative update, and Mr. Nathan Pryor will present this item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to walk through 3 items of note today. The first is regarding what Amy St. Peter presented during the executive report, and that's regarding the census. So we are tracking that as an issue regarding moving up the field operations from concluding in late October to the end of September. We are working with our national association, the National Association of Regional Councils, who's also working with the National League of Cities to voice our concerns. They are doing similar with the administration and members of Congress. To be frank, though, seemingly low likelihood of getting that date extended back to the original or the October date, end of October. But it's an issue we're going to keep tracking and bring you updates on as necessary. Secondly, we do maintain contact with Senator Livingston. That's important because in the Arizona legislature, he is the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, and also with that committee staff. Recently, we've had communication meetings with staff, but also Eric Anderson with Senator Livingston on all things transportation, of course, in the region, but also related to the extension of Proposition 400 and the planning efforts related to that. So obviously, given this past presentation or earlier presentation from Ms. Kester-Thomas, what we're sharing is, of course, very high level at this point in time, but just wanted to note that we are in communication with the state legislature. They're interested, of course, in this topic. They're not really pressing in terms of real specifics at this point, recognizing and realizing that we are early in our planning processes, but we are in communication with members of the legislature. And then finally, Madam Chair, a little bit of a look ahead. 2 years ago, we started what we're calling the MAG policy principles. These range from very specific legislative positions or asks or items, if you will, to a little bit more broader roles and responsibilities of MAG. We're going through that process now of updating the policy principles. We're looking to bring those through the policy committee process starting in September. And then we'll be bringing that through in October for hopefully recommendation of approval and ultimately approval at regional council at the end of October. This timeline will enable us to have our policy principles in place, especially with the November general election coming up, and be ready to hit the ground running if need be, with meetings, updates, check-ins with members of the legislature, in particular if there's a change in composition at the legislature. So look for that in the very near future, starting next month. With that, Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions.
Thank you. Do any members of the management committee have any questions or comments for Nathan? All right, well, thank you, Mr. Pryor. No action is needed for this item, and we'll move on to item number 7, which is request for future agenda items. Are there any requests by membership? Okay, item number 8, comments from the committee. Do we have John Cross? Are you still with us? I know he was having some technical issues.
Second.
All right, any other comments from the committee? I'm going to hold mine if we don't have John. Okay, well, with that, our business is now concluded and our meeting is adjourned. Thank you.